to our speaker. Carol Berry has been here before. We were thinking 5 years ago, we think she was here, and I remember the talk, I don't remember which year, but a fantastic talk, again, about Van Gogh, a different aspect of his career. Carol is an artist and retired art educator. Her pupils ranged from preschool to college-level adults. She has also spent many years giving art workshops, retreats, and lectures, predominantly on the life and art of Vincent Van Gogh. In 1979, she was fortunate to have a unique opportunity to take a course at Yale Divinity School with the late Henry J.M. Nounan, a Roman Catholic priest, author, and university professor. The course was entitled The Compassion of Vincent Van Gogh, and gave her many insights and a better understanding of the artist and his remarkable life. In recent years, Carol has traveled throughout Europe, retracing Van Gogh's life, visiting the village in the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, where the artist lived and worked. 2 of her essays on Van Gogh have been published in books. In 2015, Carol published Vincent Van Gogh, His Spiritual Vision in Life, which is here for you to check out tomorrow. And coming in May of this year is Learning from Henry Nounan and Vincent Van Gogh, a portrait of the compassionate life. There are some cards on the bookcase in the back of the room. That is coming out in May. The cards entitle you to a 30% discount should you choose to avail yourself of that. Born in England, Carol grew up in the Netherlands and Switzerland and now lives in Manchester. Please welcome Carol Berry, and it's Manchester, Vermont.
It's a pleasure to be here again. And I hope to give you another aspect of Vincent's life. And as you can see on this slide and on this next one, it will be about the books he read. I have to squeeze into an hour a lot of material. As you saw, he read over 490 books, many of them over and over again. He painted so much art only in 10 years of his life, and he wrote over 900 letters. So he was a very complex human being, and it's a challenge to try to put everything in. And I won't, of course, mention all those books. I will focus on some of the more familiar ones that had also the largest influence on his life. We will go through his biography again, so I like to start in the darker climate and darker colors of Holland, because that is where most of his incredible artistic inspiration really took root. The sunflowers that he painted in the south really began to grow in the dark soil of Holland. So I'm going to be giving you several authors and show you how some of these authors inspired him in his work, but also in his life. Vincent was a very complex human being. He is comprised of many influences, and that also made him become a man who associated things with other things. He thought associatively. One thing led to another thing, and all of those things are eventually portrayed in his artwork. So let us start with him in the dark town, and it was dark because Holland is quite rainy, often a lot of times, a lot of cold weather, windy weather from the ocean, and he grew up in a little town called Zundert. And what I'm going to do with many of the slides, I'm going to put pictures of the books that were part of that period of his life. And the backdrop of this slide is also a very influential picture. It's a wheat field or a cornfield, and you will see it towards the end of his life. He will come full circle, and he will remember this particular print that actually hung in his father's study. So he was a child of nature. He grew up in a very rural area. His sister said of him later on in life that nature spoke to him with 1,000 voices, and his soul listened. He was a deep, thoughtful child, and every bird's nest he found, he delighted in. And that was part of his upbringing too. His father was a pastor, a Calvinist pastor, and it was Calvin who said that nature is the book through which God speaks, and that there is not one little blade of grass, there is no color in this world that is not intended to make human beings rejoice. So he grew up with that notion that what was out there in nature was meant to make him happy, to feed him, to feed his soul. He also grew up with a what they call emblematic tradition. Reading and writing always happened with pictures. And he was very familiar with pictures in books, but also the prints that hung on the walls in his home. And a lot of the truths of life, a lot of deeper, more moral values were taught with pictures, with paintings, with prints. On the left-hand side, you see a man and a son. It's actually the prodigal son of the Bible. So he grew up with biblical stories. And these stories were obviously also in print, but they also elicited in him an image. So he was very familiar on hearing things and making images out of it, which then eventually became paintings many years later. He grew up reading a lot. That was very much valued in this Dutch pastor's family, and one of the favorite books of the children was Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. So that imagination was being spurred on, and his mother's favorite book is the blue one there. It's just called A Tour Around My Garden. It's full of symbolism associated with plants, and Vincent grew up in the parsonage gardens wherever he was as a child. And his mother taught him the symbolic value of plants, of flowers, which again came out in his paintings later on. And he was also made to believe in himself as a self-educator. He was also encouraged to constantly educate himself, to further himself, and that it was his duty to do that. So he had a rich childhood, in a way, and yet his schooling, his official schooling, ended when he was 15. And he was sent to an art gallery in The Hague to become an art dealer's apprentice. The family decided that's what he should be. Well, he lasted for about 7 years in this environment of the very stuffy, overfilled gallery, Goupil Gallery, because he was not drawn to the battle scenes of the past and the mythological stories. He was much more drawn to what he could find in galleries outside the place he was supposed to work. So he was inspired by the Graphic, the newspaper that you can see there. Huge influence on him, because the Graphic at the time was illustrated periodical that came out in London during those years that he was working there, that had famous illustrators create images of the poor. The Graphic was intended to help make the plight of the poor become much more obvious, in order to affect social change, in order to touch people, to realize these poor people needed help. And Vincent was drawn to those images. They meant a lot to him, much more. He felt art, through his upbringing, was supposed to tell a story, was supposed to touch you deeply. So this image that you see here are poor people lining up to the soup kitchen, and whenever you see the red frame around something, around an image, that's what really influenced him in many ways to do his art. So in the middle of this print, you will see another red frame of a woman crouching and holding her head. He painted those kinds of things later on. Such images were meaningful art, and he wanted to do that at some point, although he didn't know that yet. He's still not yet an artist at this point. But Millet and Daumier and Courbet were realist artists of the time, and they also painted images of the poor, of the people, of the common people. And Vincent had grown up with these people. He had grown up in the countryside, and he knew the stonebreakers or the laborers of the field. So these images meant a lot more to him. While he was in The Hague, as a teenager, late teens, he and his brother Theo came together. And this, to me, is also one of those crucial moments in his life, because it's the beginning of an art relationship that really enabled Vincent to become the artist one day. These two brothers pledged loyalty to one another, to support one another. Theo is 4 years younger than Vincent. And eventually, it is Theo who will support Vincent in his artist career. So we always have to remember, and Vincent did, because he said, once my paintings are really worthy, he wrote to at the end of his life, since he never sold anything, I swear, he said to his brother Theo, that you will have created them as much as I, and that we are making them together. So we have to always remember Theo. But what also happened at this crucial moment in the Hague years was they began their correspondence. And that's an amazing part of Vincent's life. We wouldn't know so much about Vincent if he hadn't written over 900 letters throughout his life. And 655 or 65 or 62 were written to his brother Theo, bearing his soul and talking about anything and everything that he saw, read, heard, thought about. So these letters are very, very revealing. And what he also did in his letters, he emulated, for example, the writer George Eliot, who he felt painted word pictures. So he didn't just describe an ordinary scene with ordinary words. He would evoke from something that he saw a much larger picture. He would paint a picture with words already in his letters. So that was something he gleaned from the writings of George Eliot, for example. He was, though, disillusioned by the art he was supposed to sell. He was supposed to sell art that really didn't mean that much to him. So he was at a loss. He felt he was not in the right place for him, in the right profession. He also had a disillusionment in a love relationship with a woman, and he sank into despair. He sank into homesickness and really was just very depressed. And what kept him going, again, were the familiar things like books and writing letters. So this is another section of the life while he was still at the Goupil Galleries, where he's writing to Theo, but he is immersing himself in religious writing. He needs to find a reason for his suffering, for his homesickness, for his depression. And the reason I'm putting all these books here is because each one of them had a profound and lasting effect on Vincent's life. For example, well, the Bible he read backwards and forwards. He knew that, and that was one of the supports he felt in his life. But Michelet, one of the writers he was reading, the Red Book there, said things like this: surface beauty is of little consequence. What is more important is the deeper nature, the deeper beauty that can be found in a human soul. And often in his letters, Vincent would write, if only I could capture the soul of what I'm drawing. So Michelet had a huge importance. Michelet also was a man who rejected institutional religion. And it helped Vincent eventually emancipate from his religious background. So again, another influence. For example, Ernest Renan, La Vie de Jésus over there, he said, to act well in this world, man must sacrifice all personal desires. We are not on this earth to be merely happy. We are here to realize great things for humanity. And Vincent took that to heart, because once he began to paint, that's what he wanted to do, to leave and do great things for humanity. So many of these books, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, had a tremendous impact on his struggle to come to terms with his faith and his doubts. So it was a very fruitful time, but all this reading of religious books made him completely abandon the task at hand, which was to learn how to be an art dealer apprentice. And he was dismissed from the Goupil Galleries. The other thing I want to point out to you in this little letter here, which is on Goupil paper, on the top-hand corner you see a little sketch. There was a latent desire to draw. but he didn't give in to it. But he would add little sketches like you see in these letters here. And I put a lot of letters in the background because this is his lifeline to Theo. He's writing and writing, but he's now at loss what to do. He left Goupil, he was dismissed, he was a failure, really, in his family's eyes. He became an assistant teacher, which didn't really lead to much of anything. He became a sales clerk in a bookshop, which found him reading books in the back room rather than selling them. And one of the books was Eliot's Scenes of a Clerical Life, in which she describes a country parson. And that made Vincent think, wait a minute, I could actually become a parson like my father. Maybe that will give me a way to find a connection again with my father. So he enrolled as a theological student in Amsterdam. That's another way he thought he couldn't find his purpose. And there he was supposed to learn dead languages, which he spoke about. And he had no desire to learn them. He said, all I want to do is be a country parson, to minister to the poor. I don't need to speak those dead languages. And he said, couldn't I study maybe Odyssey or books by Dickens or Michelet or learn something more from Rembrandt rather than those dead languages? So he failed too, another failure. And then he read a book which also influenced him on his next decision. He read Eliot's book, Silas Marner. I don't know if anyone has read it. It's about the weavers. Yeah, good. And in that book, there are scenes of church services among the poor. And so he decided maybe he could become a missionary. He didn't have to study for entrance exams. Well, he also didn't make it. He did not pass his 3 months of training there. But he had in his mind, taken hold of the fact that this is really what he was meant to do, to become a missionary. He had met miners in a little inn, the Charbonnage, you can see the sketch there, and he thought, well, the miners reminded him of the weavers, a disinherited race, as Eliot said, and that's where he wanted to become a missionary. And without really the approval of the Missionary Society at first, nothing could stop him, and he went to the Borinage, a very poor mining district in Belgium. The paintings you see here are not by Vincent. They're by an artist who went to the Borinage 5 years after Vincent had been there and painted what he saw. So I thought that would give you a little bit of a image of what Vincent saw when he was there. And it was a difficult time, although he immersed himself as a missionary and to such an extent that he really gave up his missionary status and decided he had to do what Jesus would do, and that is live amongst the poor as if he were one of them. So within 6 months, he received a probationary period of 6 months. He descended physically into the places that the miners were. And he looked like a miner in the end. He was sick and emaciated, and when the Belgian Missionary Society came to check on him, they couldn't recognize him, and he was promptly dismissed for good. Another failure. But he stayed there. He didn't leave. He felt this is where he needed to be. But what kept him going in this really low period of time, and this is also another important period in Vincent's life, because he's going to be hitting rock bottom. And he can either stay there or something will have to bring him up. One of the things that kept him afloat, so to speak, were the books he had with him. And believe it or not, one of them was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And another one was the... which one is it there on that side? Charles Dickens, Hard Times. Because Harriet Beecher Stowe's book reminded him of, or made him think of the miners as being like the slaves in that book. So he identified what he lived through, oftentimes, with what he read. They were all about the same life situations, the same struggles, the same deep human needs. And so Hard Times, for example, Dickens's book, which he read there, validated his own struggles also. There's a character in that book called Stephen Blackpool. Anybody read Hard Times? You remember that book? And that was a man who became a role model for Vincent. Vincent didn't just read stories, he lived them. So this Stephen Blackpool became someone who spurred him on in his low time and made him also become an advocate for the miners. Stephen Blackpool did not sacrifice his own safety, or he didn't let go of his moral values. He stood up for the poor in hard times, and that's what Vincent decided to do for the miners. So he's living, reading, along with these very realistic novels, the life of the poor and the struggle he's going through. What really then made him bounce out of that hole that he was in was also the memory of the art he had seen, of the Rembrandts and of the other artists that had meant so much to him. He had already had that latent desire, as I told you, to make drawings, but he felt that that was not what he was supposed to do at the time. But as he's there alone, he is basically abandoned by his family in the Borinage. He has nowhere to go. He has no income. He realizes that there is something that is inside of him that he should really pay attention to. He wants to know what he can do. How can I be of use? And in the same letter, he actually comes up with the answer. I am busy drawing. He begins to draw. He begins to give in to that desire to do sketches. And one of the bridge, so to speak, to him becoming the artist was Rembrandt and was Millet, because he realized that Rembrandt could speak through his art, could be a missionary or a pastor in a way, because Rembrandt was able to portray the gospel stories in an image form. He could minister through art. And so Vincent decided that's the line he would now follow, was the way to speak was not through the preaching word, but through the visual word. And so Rembrandt and Millet are a huge influence on him, and art and literature really became his new religion. He abandoned the institutional church. He was abandoned by them in a way too, and he held on to the loves that he had been imbued with all along, which was the understanding of the pictorial word, of the image, of the value of art, and of the amazing ability of art to touch you and to convey deep truths. So it's the beautiful images that you can find in his letters. In this time of darkness, he writes to Theo, I studied some of Victor Hugo's works a little, and a very beautiful book on Shakespeare. It's as beautiful as Rembrandt. So he's equating the images that Shakespeare invokes in him to the images he can see that Rembrandt is painting. The love of books, he writes, is as sacred to me as my love of Rembrandt. My God, how beautiful Shakespeare is. Who is mysterious like him? His language and style can indeed be compared to an artist's brush, quivering with fever and emotion. But one must learn to read, just as one must learn to see and learn to live. So he was finding the fire in his soul through his love of art, his love of books, and what he also wanted to do was to seek the truth in his work, to seek to portray what was real, and abandon the old academic way of doing art. After the Borinage, when he had discovered that that would be his calling, that he would follow the artist's path, he had nowhere else to go but back to his parents, who had moved to a little town called Etten. And here he began to draw furiously. This is his schooling. He is self-taught in his art. And he had read Dickens, for example. Dorrit was the book he was reading during this time. And Dickens, in his work, portrayed the types of people, types of poor people that he had encountered in the suburbs of London, for example. And what Vincent wanted to do was to draw types like Dickens wrote about them. I should be very happy if someday I could draw them, these peasants, so that those little-known types would be brought before the eyes of the people, just like Charles Dickens did in his work, introducing us to ways of life that we were not otherwise familiar with. But during this time, too, he had great clashes with his strict Calvinist father, who did not approve of these realist modern novels. He thought they were going to be leading him astray. And he was reading Michelet, he was reading Balzac, Père Goriot, he was reading books that his father absolutely didn't approve of. And the clashes were so violent that he was actually thrown out of the parsonage on Christmas Eve. Well, where else could he go but to a distant relative in The Hague? And this is probably, we could say, the place where he put his foot on an artist's path. He wanted to be on his own. He wanted to enter into the life of the artists in The Hague. And here he is now. He's 28 years old, and he has only 9 more years to live. And he hasn't begun to paint yet. So just imagine all that intensity that's going to come out of him. Thanks to Theo, who now is working as an art dealer apprentice, he is able to rent an apartment which becomes like a harbor for the poor, like a refuge, like what he has been so familiar with in the graphic in the left there, the picture of the poor huddled together. He had these poor coming to his studio. Those were his models. The people from the soup kitchens, the people from the alleyways, and they came for a warm glass of water, milk, and a few coins. So Vincent still has that latent desire to minister to the poor. He's still doing the physical missionary work, so to speak, but he's also learning to draw. He's also reading, again, Eliot, for example, Felix Holt the Radical, who he felt, again, was a man who didn't seek to be civilized in outward things, but who sought to be deeply and richly spiritual and inward. And so Vincent is struggling with what he has to do to survive, what he has to do to further his career as an artist, but also what to do to strengthen his soul. His search for God never died. And he wanted to be a deep man, a spiritual man, and he writes about that to Theo. He's also reading Zola for the first time, and Zola has gripped him. From now on, we will see many Zola books that will inspire him and validate the things he does. So Le Ventre de Paris is a book about the poor in the poor sections of Paris, and he lives with Zola in those places. He's reading Charles Dickens, too. He's not abandoning the favorite writers that have touched him deeply. So this is a frontispiece of one of the book, Hard Times. And as you can see, even the artwork in these books inspired him to draw and sketch. He did have a model, and he had the model sit in the position that he saw in the frontispiece of Charles Dickens. So he's inspired by many of these books, not just the reading of the stories, but also the visual, the imagery in them. And at this point, too, one of the models that he has been drawing is a very sick and pregnant prostitute called Sine. And he, inspired by Victor Hugo, who says that above and over reason, there is conscience. You do what is right, even if it doesn't seem reasonable. And what he felt was right was to take Sine, this really very sick, poor woman, into his little studio where he is living thanks to Theo. And she became not only his model, but they became a couple. He eventually actually wanted to marry her. And he's using her and also telling Theo about it in his letters. And Theo is aghast. You know, here is his brother living with a prostitute. What are his parents? How will they react to this? But he said to Theo, based on the book that he read by Zola, The Gin Mill, these women are not bad. The impossibility of living a straight life in the midst of gossip and calumny of the suburbs is the cause of their faults. She isn't bad. She just doesn't know what it is to be good, to live a good life. So in his heart still, he has that desire to help another person, to bring her out of the misery, to show her a better way of life. So he's using her as a model, but he's also at the same time trying to save her. He's studying painting now. He's studying perspective. So at the same time as caring for this woman and seeing her through the delivery of the child, he is painting, learning perspective, and describing the scenes to Theo in his many letters. And one of the scenes that he looked out upon from the window reminded him of a page in a book by Victor Hugo. So it was always intertwined, what he was reading, what he was seeing, what he was doing. And one of the greatest novels that had a very big influence on him is Les Miserables, and I think we all know the story of this book. Very powerful book. And he felt that in that book, Les Miserables, the prostitute Fantine was somebody that was the essence of what it was like to be a prostitute. He compared Fantine to Cine. So Hugo was able in his story to create a character that was universal, a character of misery, of poverty, and Vincent wanted to do the same with his art. And he is drawing Cine here as an emblem or as an image of sorrow, of poverty, of a universal feeling of hopelessness, of helplessness. So again, Hugo, with his ability to create the essence in his characters of traits, of human traits, he now is trying to emulate that with his art. So it had a great influence on him. Well, he tried to save Cine, but it didn't work. She could not change her ways, and his brother Theo eventually was able to convince Vincent to let her be, to leave her. It was difficult for Vincent. He had grown fond of her. He also felt it was another failure, that he couldn't save her or give her a better life. He had grown fond of her daughter and the little child that was born. So again, dejected, depressed, lonely, he left to a very remote part of Holland, Drenthe. And this is really the place where Vincent put both feet on the artist's path. Here he decided to devote all his efforts, all his energy, just to making art. From now on, he never again would really take in another human being and try to save that person or do the missionary work that he had felt he was supposed to do. From now on, his missionary work will be happening through his art. He's reading avidly. He's there for 3 months, reading, writing, painting. He's reading Longfellow. In every life some rain must fall was a poem he read, and days be dark and dreary. And then Vincent says, that is true. It cannot be otherwise, yet I wonder if the number of dark and dreary days can't sometimes get too great. So he's inspired by Longfellow, he's inspired by Hugo, who writes a book where he gets this concept of the white ray and the black ray. And he writes many times about his father, still, the struggle he's had of not being understood by his father. And he says that his father has a black ray in him. Somebody who is dark, who's not open, who is closed. And yet there are others, like Millet, for example, and Victor Hugo and Zola. They have the white ray in them, which is to seek good, to do good, to be open to life. So he's in his letters referring to many of the books he's reading, and during this time it is a Victor Hugo book. After 3 months, he moves to Noonan, which is another parsonage. His father is a pastor, and he reluctantly goes home, but he has no other place to go. And in this place, he will be for a few years and create really his Dutch masterpieces. It will be the last place in Holland he lives. And it is a time where he struggles still with his art. He is still trying to learn how to draw the subjects that he's seeing, the farmers, the peasants, with soul. He's perfecting his skills at rendering them correctly, but now he also wants to make sure that we feel what he sees in them. He is also still, as you can imagine, having clashes with his father and reading books that actually inflame the relationship to deteriorate even more. He's reading Mes haines, My Hatreds. It's Zola's attack on the bourgeois convention. And he's reading Daudet, the Evangelist, which is an anti-clerical book. Vincent is not making life very easy for his father. He's really creating a lot of problems, but he's still able to paint for a while, and he's drawn to the countryside, to the weavers. Eliot's book has not left him. He still is filled with the imagery of the weavers, and now he's actually able to paint them. And he's in their homes, trying to, again, distill the essence, the type of what a weaver would be, the modern figure of a weaver. And he is drawn to the potato farmers who will eventually help him create his masterpiece in Holland. And he's reading Millet. He sees Millet's paintings in the countryside where the peasants are working just the way Millet also portrayed them. And he's reading the biography of Millet. And Millet, too, was somebody who saw in the insignificant, in the lowly, something as valuable as something else. Like the potato is as valuable as a pomegranate. A potato farmer is as valuable as somebody who's living in the city. And he wanted to bring that out, and that is also what Vincent desired to do. So his closeness to the peasants in Holland led to that famous painting, The Potato Eaters. Yeah, it's something, I'm going very fast through all of these things, so it's hard to really get into each of these images. But he again is reading a book by Zola, which is called Pot Bouillé, it's potluck. And in that book, there is a character called Octave Buret. And like with Stephen Blackpool, with Felix Holt, the characters of these novels, he incorporates some of those characteristics. Octave Buret was a man who was modern, who was free from traditional constraints. And what Vincent wanted to do was to break away from the traditional academy art constraints. He didn't want to paint what was considered beautiful by the Art Academy. He didn't feel that that was the goal of art, was to portray something beautiful. What was important was to portray something honest and something that was depicting true life, the way it was lived by these farmers here. And he felt that that's also what Dickens did, that's what Eliot did, that's what Zola did. He was part of the group of the realist authors and artists, depicting what was honest. Art did not have to be beautiful. Art had to tell a story. Art had to draw you in. Art had to open your eyes to what was really true. The last painting he did while he was in Holland was a painting after his father's death. His father died suddenly without ever having had a chance to reconcile with Vincent. Vincent remained the prodigal son that was not welcomed home. And he will write about that relationship with his father in many, in many letters to Theo. It really was very heavy on his heart, the relationship. So in this painting, it's his father's Bible open to the Isaiah, the book of the suffering servant. And what Vincent is doing, he's juxtaposing the Bible with a very, very well-read novel called La Joie de Vivre, The Joy of Living by Émile Zola, which he felt portrayed also the story of a suffering servant in the character of a servant girl in that book. What he had tried to tell his father was that the modern books, in those books, you'll find the same kinds of stories that the Bible is full of. Stories of salvation, of redemption, of forgiveness. And that is something that his father could not realize. He's also reading a book by Zola called The Artwork, L'Œuvre, in which Zola makes the artist visible in his own artwork. And what Vincent is doing here, he is portraying a very personal painting. He's not painting something that anyone told him to paint. He's painting a personal statement about himself, which in a sense is an expressionistic piece of work. He is putting his own self in his art. That was also inspired by Zola. After the death of his father, Vincent had to leave Holland. There was no place for him. The parsonage was closed. Family members had to disperse and go to other places. At this point, Vincent was ready to go to Paris to join his brother Theo and to really go there where the art scene was alive and on the cutting edge. And here he is. He's portraying himself as a dapper artist. And it is, again, based on another character in a book called Bel-Ami by Guy de Maupassant. Bel-Ami was a very successful optimist who charmed his way into society. And Vincent thought that he would do the same. Now he was in Paris, he was an artist already, and what he needed were models. Female models. And he would think with the characteristics of a Bel-Ami, he would have access to the high society where women would want him to be drawing them. The other things that were going on in Paris, of course, was the new group of what we now know as Impressionist artists. And like reading and learning from authors, he learned from these teachers, the Impressionist artists. The light-filled canvases, the color palettes that now he was exposed to, so different from the darker colors that he had used in Holland. So it's opening his mind. He's also being exposed to the Japanese artwork that is going to have a tremendous influence on him. Vincent was just open to all of these different things that were going on around him. It was like a greenhouse for him. And he's reading books about Japanese art. He's reading all kinds of books about color. And he is not achieving, however, the character of a Bel-Ami. As you can see in this, it's a rather interesting little painting because he's really showing us what he wasn't achieving, getting live models. He has a plaster cast there, not a nice, beautiful Parisian model. And he does say, the best thing one could do from all points of view would be to paint portraits of women and children. But it seems to me that it won't be I who does that. I don't feel I'm enough of a Mr. Bel-Ami for that. So he paints, obviously, shoes, still lifes, things that he has access to. But his shoes also tell stories. It's not just a pair of shoes. It talks about hard work, maybe, about poverty. They are personal. They're his shoes. And he's putting things on the canvas. He's reading books, lots of very varied books, most of them by Zola. This next picture, I'm just showing you the difference between his peasant drawings and paintings in Holland to the amazing explosion of colors and brushstrokes that happened in these 2 years that he was in Paris. He is beginning to paint like we know him, like we know Vincent Van Gogh. But he's drawn, even though he's in Paris in the city, he's drawn to the laborers, he's drawn to the ones who work hard. Those are the people he has associated with all his life and wanted to put on his canvases. After the 2 years living with Theo, and we don't have many letters from that period since they were together, but we do know that it was not an easy time. Theo was trying to be a representative of the art world. He was an art dealer of some renown at that point, and Vincent was passionate, was spontaneous, was compulsive, and it made living with him rather difficult for Theo, to say the least. And Vincent, too, at this point, had enough of the city life. He was that country boy at heart. He never stopped being a country boy at heart. And he yearned to go back to a place where he could be amongst the peasants again, surrounded by wheat fields. And he's painting himself. This is the last portrait he painted of himself in Paris. He painted many self-portraits because he didn't have other models. And he paints himself as a peasant painter. Just about this time, he read Tolstoy, My Religion, about the book My Religion. And Tolstoy, too, had abandoned himself to becoming a peasant writer, back to his roots. And so it's almost as if these two were on the same wavelength. They both had also the same definition of art. That good art is art that makes the viewer of the artwork feel what the artist tried to put into the work. Tolstoy said that, Vincent felt that too. And the other book I put there is a book called Hokusai, which is written by Edmond de Goncourt, a very famous writer, a French writer, and he wrote many books about Japanese art. And Vincent, being taken with Japanese art, with the simplicity of the Japanese art works, the daily, ordinary things that the Japanese depicted in their work, he wanted to emulate that. He had the colors now, he had the brush strokes, and he had the idea of creating simple, everyday scenes, and by putting them on canvas, lifting them up into something more extraordinary for us to be able to experience. So he gets on a train and he drives all the way south on this train as far as he wanted to go to Marseille, because there was an artist that had lived there who also influenced him greatly. He got off the train, however, in the little town of Arles, because what he saw was this beautiful, twinkling, a bright city under a little bit of a dusting of snow. And it just made him think of again, of the Japanese, the light and the brightness of the colors that the Japanese used in their work. And he got off the train. And this is where he stayed now for the next year. He will be in Arles. This is a place that many people visit. It is a place where most of his more famous artworks come from. And he is there for 444 days, so a little over a year. He makes about 100 drawings, produces over 200 paintings, writes 200 letters, and reads many, many books. So it's a full time for him. And it's a time where he breaks away a little bit from the Impressionist artists. He didn't want to just create colorful surfaces with the light shining off of it, that very luminous way of painting. He wanted to create more of a deeper sense of the power of nature in his work. He wanted a blossoming fruit tree to really have solidity, to show that it was something that was producing life, that was part of the cycle of life. It had to be deeper, that yearning to be a man of inner strength, inner vision, inner spirituality was coming out in some of the paintings he did. And he painted many, many orchard images, wanting again to capture that essence, the type, or the essence of what it was to be alive, for nature to be alive. He wrestled with nature when he was there. And he also felt it was his duty as a painter to bring that out for us to see. And he's reading a book there also about colors. Delacroix was a romantic artist, but who had a great understanding of the power of color. Not of surface color, but of suggestive color, to change the colors in your paintings so they became even more powerful. Color speaks. Goethe said that color is a language of your soul. We all are responding to the colors around us. They touch us in a way that we don't necessarily are conscious of. So Delacroix was a huge influence on his work also. He moved into the Yellow House in Arles, which he called the Yellow House, and it was a place where he hoped to create an artist community, like the Japanese artists who lived in community as brothers, a brotherhood of artists. And he hoped that he could, again, create something similar to that. He invited artists. The only one who came was Gauguin. And he only came because Theo almost bribed him to go. Knowing that Vincent was very, very lonely, wanted this artist community, needed to feel that he was part of something. For Gauguin, visit, Vincent began to paint these sunflowers that we're so familiar with. And he painted a series of them. He wanted this yellow house to be a true artist's home, where everything in it was art, was based on art. And he was, again, also reading books about color, and he read it in German, Goethe's Farbenlehre, the theory of color. And he also felt that the artists of the future would be using color as part of the artist's vocabulary. And then he painted the same as I just showed you before, but I'm showing you this one because he showed this image to a friend of his in Arles, who thought it was a most horrible painting. And Theo got a letter from Vincent where Vincent said that this friend couldn't understand why anyone would just paint such boxes of houses. It had nothing really there. And then Vincent goes on to reflect, and I'm quoting again from a letter, Zola also did a certain boulevard in the city at the beginning of his book, The Gin Mill. So he's painting, Zola is painting with words. He painted a boulevard in his book, The Gin Mill. And Gustave Flaubert described the corner of an avenue in the summer heat at the beginning of his book, Perruchet. So his difficulty of creating an image that somebody really didn't like, he found other artists, authors, who did the same, who tried to describe an ordinary boulevard in such a way that it drew you in. And Vincent said, and it does me good to do that, to do what's difficult, to create a painting of ordinary things like boxy houses. It does me good. But that doesn't stop me from having a tremendous need for, shall I say the word, for religion. So I go outside and I paint the stars. So trying hard to create an image of something ordinary like these houses was an effort for him. And what he needed to do then to counteract that effort was to go out into this Provençal's evening, night sky, and paint the stars. And the cafe there, the night cafe, which is a very famous one, reminds him of a scene in Guy de Maupassant's book. So he paints and he thinks and he sees the imagery of books that he's read, and they're all part of the same experience. But he's also reading Walt Whitman. And that's, to me, always amazing that he even would read poetry like that, in English, of course. And the poems in Leaves of Grass, where Whitman uses symbolist imagery, where Whitman calls for a future filled with love and friendship under the great vault of heaven. And that's what Vincent feels. He's under the vault of heaven, and he sees the symbolism, that vastness of the creation, and how it would be wonderful for everybody to be able to live under that vault of heaven in love and friendship. So Walt Whitman and Vincent really connected on many levels. He painted many, many scenes of landscapes like he knew the Impressionists did, and that those were being sold by Theo, so he thought he would try that too. Wheat fields, again, were very much part of his background. He felt very involved with the symbolism of wheat, the germinating seed and the harvesting and the death of the seed and then the new life from the seed. So that was all part of that whole symbolism and metaphor of life. But he also read another book by Zola, and he says that in the distance, you can see up here, is a ruin of Montmajour that he had visited. And in that Montmajour, he experienced this old type of garden, the neglected garden. And I explored that old garden and stole some excellent figs there. And if the garden had been bigger, it would have made you, Theo, think of Émile Zola's Paradou, the beautiful garden that is described in the book, The Sins of Father Mouret. where a fallen clergyman finds solace and healing amid nature, amid a vast garden, neglected garden, but fertile garden, full of trees and bushes and flowers. And that was a place that this clergyman found healing. And Vincent immediately thought of that similarity of where he was. And this is the kind of healing Vincent wants to do with his painting, like Zola was describing in his book. Another book by Zola is The Earth, or La Terre, where Zola writes about the great natural processes of seed time and harvest, death and renewal in his novel, as the vitality which is not human, but is the elemental energy of life, of a life force. So Vincent is reading this, and he is in the fields around Arles, seeing the sower, experiencing the harvest at some point. And in this painting, he puts both seed time and harvest together, because you can see the ripe band of wheat in the background. It's a parable in paint. It's an agrarian parable. The sower was a very important figure in Vincent's life. He knew them, he saw them, he knew what they were doing, which was sowing life and being part of the cycles of life, symbols of life. He's reading still, and I'm jumping from landscape to self-portrait again, but he's reading many books on Japanese art. He is still fascinated by that. And based on one of the novels, which describes a Buddhist monk, he paints himself as one. And this is a portrait that he actually exchanges with Gauguin, because the Japanese artists did that too. They gave each other work, and so in exchange for one. So he's reading and writing and painting at the same time. Some of the imagery of the books inspired him to create that wonderful image of the young woman called La Mousmée. I'm bringing Rembrandt back. Rembrandt was the impetus for Vincent to make that jump into becoming an artist. Rembrandt never left him. He never forgot the influence of Rembrandt on him. And I'm bringing this back because it's a painting that is narrative. That is what Rembrandt was so good at, using a very ordinary family, a grandmother rocking the child. She has a rope in her hand, pulling the cradle, and the mother is reading a book. This is the Holy Family. This is a way that Rembrandt portrayed the fact that the Holy Family from the nativity scene is an ordinary family, that our families are sacred too. And so Vincent was very much inspired by this painting, and in Arles he befriended a woman, Madame Le Roulin, who had just given birth. And he paints a beautiful picture of her based on this Rembrandt remembrance of this Rembrandt painting. And as you can see, it's the same image of a cradle rocker. She holds a rope in her hand. She's called La Berceuse, the cradle rocker. But this image is not just based on Rembrandt. In true fashion, Vincent put lots of other things into his paintings. His paintings are multi-layered. This painting is also inspired by a book by Pierre Loti called The Icelandic Fisherman. Pierre Loti wrote about the fishermen in their boats, high at sea, away from home, often having an image of the Holy Mother, or Mother Mary, in the berth of the boat. And as they went to sleep, that rocking sensation would be felt as if they were rocked to sleep by a mother. And Vincent thought having La Berceuse as an image on the boat would make them remember the lullabies of their youth and not feel so lonely. So he's still ministering. He's still trying to make life easier. I have three pictures now of books, just books, that he painted. Cheap novels. I have images of such novels here. They were in Europe. This is my dad's book. They were just yellow-covered, cheap paper. Most of those novels are that way. And often he would say, you know, still dealing with his father's difficulty with him reading novels. He said, "Is the Bible enough? On the contrary, if one wants truth, life as it is, we have to read these modern life stories too." There's a lovely little image of a book and the almond blossoms. I have nothing about it here except that the colors must have inspired him. There's another one here with books. La Joie de Vivre is on the table. It's flowering oleanders that are flowering madly, and he felt that in order to be creative, in order to be putting what you feel onto your canvas or into pages of a book, you have to abandon yourself. You have to abandon yourself to the creative inspirations. And he felt that the oleanders had that sense of abandonment. And he certainly felt that sense when he looked at this sunset of willows. Reading another book by Guy de Maupassant, who said, artists, writers shouldn't just give the banal photographic view of something. They have to exaggerate a little bit, bring out the essence of what is there. Abandon yourself. You, as an artist, have that liberty to exaggerate a little bit so that you can bring out the real true feeling of what it is that you're looking at. This is another beautiful painting. He calls it the Poet's Garden. He had just read an article about Dante and Boccaccio, Giotto, Botticelli, and he felt this was a garden that they would have walked through, discussing all those lofty things. Another painting that is inspired by a book called Tartarin de Tarascon by Alphonse Daudet, a Provençal author, who described the diligence, the carriage going to Tarascon. Gauguin and Vincent did not do well together. They clashed badly, and that resulted in the incidence of the ear, Vincent losing part of his ear. And the next few months he's going to be spending in recuperation. Gauguin leaves him. He is abandoned once again and alone, and allowed to paint as part of his therapy by the doctor. And here he's painting his own story. He's painting the book by I think Raspail. It's an annual on health. He's reading about what he should do to stay healthy, and one of the things he should do is eat onions. So he has them in the painting. And of course, he writes letters, he smokes his pipe, he has his wine, all those things that are necessary for his own healing. And during all these months, he's still reading Harriet Beecher Stowe, Dickens, Hugo, constantly reading. He's reading a book by Voltaire called Candide. This is a painting he did before he's leaving Arles. It's almost another storied image. Candide, in that book, it's about optimism, about seeing the good despite the bad, that there's always something good is there if you look long enough. And so he paints these trees in the foreground, and if you look beyond the trees, you see the blossoming of fruit trees. If you look long enough, you can be sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, a favorite phrase of his from the Bible. So Voltaire and Candide were another way for him to overcome some of the difficulties that he had. But he is not allowed to stay in Arles. The citizens of Arles, after the incidents of the ear, do not trust him anymore, and he's forced to leave. His house is boarded up, and he signs himself into an asylum for mentally disabled or people with issues that cannot live alone. And now starts almost the last year of his life, where he still paints some amazing images and keeps on reading. And he is there looking through the bars of his window, just like in his painting, looking beyond to the beautiful walled-in wheat field. So he sees the bars, he doesn't paint them, he's looking beyond the bars, and he's seeing the wheat field in all of the seasons. He's there for a whole year. Just like the Zen poet whom he had read had said, obey nature, listen to nature if you want to really be excellent in art, and paint nature throughout the 4 seasons of the cycle. So he's doing that. And he's finding peace. He's finding solace in nature, like in the Paradou by Zola. He is finding healing. From now on, for these last few months in Saint-Rémy, in that asylum, he is beginning to paint for his own healing, for his own comforting. He is grounded in nature, and he's bringing out on his canvas what he is getting in his own soul, which is the strength and solace. He's painting such images while he is at the asylum. Very well-known image, too. And during this time, he's reading Shakespeare. You know, we think of him in a mental asylum. We think he may have mental issues. He had difficulties. He had seizures. He had very difficult moments where he would almost descend into a pit of pain and darkness, and then would clamber out again and paint while he was able to. So he's painting and reading Shakespeare, and when the Shakespeare gets too heavy for him and he needs a break, what he does is he goes out and looks at a pine tree or a blade of grass, which is again reminding us of Walt Whitman, who would also say that a blade of grass was no less than the motion of the stars. In a blade of grass, you could find more than just the grass. It spoke to you of nature, of the whole of nature. So ordinary things are extraordinary if you look long enough and you see the essence. And that's what Vincent felt and why he painted these images. Just a field of grass, just a pine tree. It grounded him, it healed him. I'm showing you these images because Vincent, although he wrote many letters and he wrote about his struggles, this is almost a storybook of images that show the cycle of his deep descent into one of his seizures. He's in the quarry on the left-hand side. He's down in a hole. Physically, that's the way it felt. He would describe it. And then he would struggle to get out of that depressed or that weakened state that he was in. And he's got the struggle coming through the ravine over there on the right. And then the darkness lifting on the left-hand side. And then that rejoicing that he was back to being able to paint and back to feeling life in its fullest. And then he would descend back into the hole. So that happened over and over again in the time in Saint-Rémy. So after a year that he was there, Theo was worried about Vincent. He realized that Vincent wasn't getting better, and he wanted Vincent to come back north, closer to Paris. And so for the last 70 days of Vincent's life, he lives in a little town of Auvers. And here he paints 70 paintings, so almost a painting a day. And you can see, I put a little image of what he painted when he was still in Holland. Thatched cottages, and he's coming full circle, thatched cottages in Auvers. But look at the energy, look at the life force that he's expressing in his paint. It's a very different expressive quality to his art. He's painting his doctor, Dr. Gachet, who was a doctor who Vincent felt was just as badly off as him. He also had depressive moodinesses, and he's painting Gachet in a stance where, you know, he is kind of depressed and melancholy. But he's also painting him with a few books on the table. And the two books on the table are books that Vincent had read, and what he's trying to show what he's trying to show his brother Theo with this painting is that Gachet may have his problems too, but he's also a worldly man, and he reads like we do. And both of the books are books that have to do with illness and death, yet also with salvation through art. So the image of Gachet is more than just the portrait of Gachet. It talks about the man, talks about the books and the power that these books may have on his healing. And the foxglove that is there portrayed in front of him is a symbol of medicine, the fact that this is a doctor. So he's putting many symbolical things into his paintings. And he's drawn to the wheat fields again. The wheat fields surrounded Auvers and were ripe at the time that he came there. And the image on the left-hand bottom is the same that you saw at the very beginning of Vincent, the funeral procession through the wheat field, death, and yet there's also life, new life. and that he's portraying the wheat fields over and over again, many of them in his last days. He drew strength from that. And he said, even in the form of a painting, if you look at a wheat field, you can feel the power of life and of nature. Well, Vincent was wounded one of the days that he went out to paint in the wheat fields in a mysterious way. He sustained a gunshot wound. Nobody knew at the time what had happened. He made it back to his little attic room in the inn. And that's where Vincent basically then died. He died of something that nobody really knew what had happened. Theo came, was with his brother, was with him for 2 days until Vincent died. There are now theories about what happened. And I don't know if has anyone here seen the movie Loving Vincent? Yeah. That tries to deal with what happened in those days after he was shot, or before he was shot. And actually, it's a very interesting thing, but that movie is based on a little booklet called Who Killed Vincent, by a reporter who wrote about it in 1962. So there's some interesting theories about it, but the fact is that Vincent fulfilled what he had tried to do. And I'm just going to show you 2 more slides. I know I'm running over. But he left us a legacy. He left us a legacy, which is what he wanted to do. He wanted to draw images, paintings that would comfort us. That was one of the desires he had expressed to Theo. And drawing starry, that's his, sorry, I'm 1 slide ahead of you. This is where he's buried, in the wheat field, in a cemetery outside over there. But what I wanted to show you was this one, which we all know as one of his most powerful images, I think. Most people know the Starry Night. And with Starry Night, he says a beautiful quote, at times there's something indescribable in the aspects of nature. All nature seems to speak or sing. And going home, one has the same feeling as when one has finished a book by Victor Hugo. As for me, I cannot understand that not everybody sees it and feels it. Nature and God does it for everyone who has eyes and ears and a heart to understand. And that's what he tried to do with his paintings, to give us the eyes, the ears, to understand what nature was trying to tell us. That in the finite things of this world, the infinite is expressed. The very last slide is this one. I wanted to leave you with the sower, which is a symbol of life, new life, which keeps on happening. And in this image too, he combined so much of who he was. Japanese art, it's a very distinct flavor of the composition. The sun was a symbol for the divine in many of his paintings in the south of France. Obviously the sower, sowing seeds, constantly walking and sowing seeds, new life, new life. And he's using the colors of one of his favorite artists, Delacroix, which is Prussian blue and citron yellow. He describes this painting. He's doing it as an homage to one of the artists that has influenced him so much. So that's what I want to leave you with tonight, with this image of constantly new life coming forth. And for us to, when we go out, and soon it's spring, we will see that happening. And let it touch us on a very deep level too. So that's it. Thank you. We will have questions and answers, but I want to tell you, I almost want to apologize that it's so dense, it's so much, and I wish I could do much more slower and let you see things more, but that's Vincent. So yes, there was a question, I think, here, because I'm happy to answer questions.
Could you describe a little more about how Vincent Van Gogh lost his ear?
Okay.
Rumors, and I kind of get it, but I'd like to hear.
How he lost his ear?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, we don't know. Vincent never wanted to divulge what really happened. Like, he also didn't want to divulge who wounded him or whatever happened. The people who did whatever they did were free. He left them. But there are indications in his letters. He did say to Theo, Gauguin will be telling you things about his time with me. He never told Theo exactly what happened, but he did say, don't believe all Gauguin says. Think of the character Tartarin de Tarascon, who was an exaggerating, tall tale teller. So whatever Gauguin may say, don't believe him. The other thing is, Gauguin left his fencing equipment in Arles and asked Vincent to send it on to Paris. And in a letter to Theo, Vincent says, I'm sending back Gauguin's fencing equipment. My only weapon is my brush. So he almost says, he doesn't say Gauguin did it. The theory is that he possibly did in self-defense, because Vincent had lost it. He was very upset that Gauguin was leaving. So I can't tell you exactly what happened. There is a book called Vincent's Ear, I think. I don't know if you have it in the library, or The Ear of Vincent. A woman tried to discover what actually happened, and there are some theories, but we never will know exactly.
Mystery.
Yeah, it's a mystery.
Thank you.
I've always looked at Van Gogh's work as magical, and to me personally, I don't know whether he looked at it the same way. Everybody looks at paintings and art in different ways, but I felt rather strongly that he captured the essence of things in terms of the energy in the life around him. Mm-hmm. And it really is displayed not only in the color, but in the brush strokes themselves. And as a student of shamanism, if you know something about that, there is energy in life in all things. And I felt like he had a sense of that essence which he portrayed in his work.
Yeah. I think you're right. He did have a sense of that. Many letters he would write that he would wrestle with nature until she told him her secret. And the secret then, what he then kind of tries to express is that what you see points to something that you don't see. So, and eventually, 20th century art, Paul Klee will say the same thing. Art is about the things you don't see. It's trying to point you there. So he was very deep. He was definitely also touched by the Zen philosophy. So, yeah, there's a lot of depth in his work.
Okay, your presentation was marvelous.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Did he read these works in translation, or did he know several languages?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. I'm hard of hearing. So.
Did he read these works in translation?
Oh, well, that's a good question. Yes, I read the 900 letters in translation. However, when I wrote the book on the first book that the library now has, I wasn't given the right to the translation, to use the translations in the book. And I have many quotes in that book of Vincent's letters. So because I do speak Dutch and I do speak French, I did translate those quotes for my book, but I didn't read all of them in
My question was, did he read in translation when he read English?
Oh, the books you mean? I'm sorry.
Yes.
No, well, he could read French, German, English, and Dutch. So wherever he could, and most of the authors were either one of those speakers. Yes, so I'm sorry, I didn't understand originally, but he did read them in the original languages. Yeah. Yeah, that is remarkable in itself, isn't it? With schooling ending at age 15. He lived in London for a while, he worked there too, but so he had a proclivity, I think, for learning languages. The Dutch generally do very well with languages. Yeah. So, thank you. It was wonderful to speak to you.